This is a 1983 R80ST, and I'm going to remove the rear drive, the rear monoshock, and then the rear swing arm. One issue with the rear shock removal is that it won't come out of this bracket if the bolt to secure the top subframe is all the way in. It bumps into the bottom of the bolt. So you have to kind of back that up a little so that you can get the top shackle out of the bracket. The bottom shock mount is secured with a bolt, 2 wave washers, and a nut, and once you remove it, you just slide the shock out. The rear drive is secured to the swing arm with 4 bolts here on this flange, so I'll remove those. Now, before I remove the rear drive and the swing arm, I'm supporting the swing arm with a jack stand just to take some of the weight off of the bearings. And I also removed the fill and drain plugs on the swing arm to drain it, and the fill and the drain plugs on the rear drive. Now, the fill plug has a little breather cap on the top, so I find if I use a deep socket, it is easy to take that off because it fits right over the little breather. Now, I did find water inside the swing arm when I drained the oil. That's not surprising because the rubber boot between the swing arm and the transmission was ripped. So I know the bike did spend some time outside, and that's why the water got inside the swing arm. Now, to remove the 4 12-sided nuts that secure the rear drive to the swing arm, I can't get a socket in there because there's no clearance. And on this particular nut, you can't get a socket on because there's the bracket for the rear monoshock. So what I did is those are fit a 12 millimeter wrench, and I took a box wrench and I ground it down so it'll fit on the nuts. Now, mine were pretty tight, so actually I have found that the best way to get them to come loose is just to beat on it a little bit with a hammer, and then they'll loosen right up. So sometimes get a bigger hammer is the best way to proceed. Now, you'll notice that when I remove the nuts here, this nut cannot come off all the way because it bumps into the flange for the monoshock. So what I have to do is loosen up all the other nuts and then slide this back a little bit, the rear drive, so I get some more clearance. Now, to get the rear drive to separate from the swing arm, I had to use what I sometimes call my gentle persuader to get it to separate. So a couple of whacks and it slides right on out. So this is the drive gear that goes to the rear drive unit, and it engages in the splines on the drive shaft. So that's how the rear drive is powered, by the drive shaft. The drive shaft, which is inside the swing arm, connects to the rear output flange of the transmission, and there's a rubber bellows secured by a couple of hose clamps that fits over that assembly. So I'll remove the bellows, and then there are 4 bolts that attach the drive shaft to the output flange of the transmission, and I'll be able to remove those. Now, the rubber boot or bellows is held on by some straps, and this is one of them that I got off. So it's a screwdriver that you got to get on there, and this one's pretty bunged up, but I'm getting it to come loose. So once I get that off, normally what you do is just slide the boot back to get to the nuts that secure the drive shaft to the transmission output flange. but I'm just going to cut this off with a knife because it's completely rotted. I removed that rubber bellows, and these are the four 12-sided bolts that secure the drive shaft to the transmission output shaft. And I found that it's easier to get at them if you take a 10 mil box and grind it down, because there's not a lot of clearance on these. And then when you get them on, what you want to do is put the transmission in first gear, so there's a lot of engine resistance. And then if you take a hammer, you can get them to break loose just like that. So what you'll have to do is rotate this drive shaft to get to all four bolts. So you'll have to take the transmission into neutral, rotate it, put it in first, and then loosen up the next bolt. Once I break all the nuts loose, then I can back them out by hand, but I don't want to drop them down into the drive shaft. So I'm kind of careful here to get them to come loose. Now I normally replace these when I reinstall the drive shaft, just because they take so much stress. It's probably worth it for how little they cost to just put new ones in. Now that I've got the four bolts out, the drive shaft flange is loose and off of the output flange on the transmission. There's a plastic cap that fits over this hole in the frame, and this is the pivot bolt and locking nut that secure the swing arm to the frame. Now to remove that locking nut, it's a tight fit, so what you need is a 26 millimeter socket that's been cut down so that it can slide in and fit over the bolt. And then you just back that lock nut out, and then you can take an Allen, insert it into the pivot bolt, and back that out. Now I've got that cut down 26 millimeter socket, and I put it on the nut, and they're usually pretty tight. So I find that if I brace myself against the peg and I lean into it, I can get it to crack loose. So then you just back that locking nut out of there. Now to take out the pivot bolt, it's an Allen that fits into the center, and they can be a little bit hard, but this one's turning. There we go. And you just back that all the way out. Yeah, still got a little ways to go. And part of it is I got off my jack stand. Okay, so that's the pivot bolt, the threads and the pivot, and this is what fits inside the swing arm bearing. Now that I've got both pivot bolts loose, I can just pick the swing arm up and get it out. Now this is the flange on the drive shaft that attaches to the output flange on the transmission, and I'm going to remove the drive shaft because I'm going to powder coat the swing arm. So here's the rear drive monoshock and swing arm removed from the bike. And then one other thing I did was I removed the rear subframe and the muffler that was attached to it. So pretty much now I'm down to the frame and the engine and the transmission and the airbox that need to be removed. So we're making progress on the disassembly.